Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 211 of the Noclip Crewcast. And we have a special one this week. I shouldn't have said hello. I should have said Hekki Grace, everybody. And welcome to the special 1000xResist episode of the pod. Myself and Jesse are here. Frank is in Japan watching wrestling, I assume, and Jeremy is up in Mendocino somewhere enjoying the forest. But we're delighted to be joined by Remy Siu and Pinki Li from Sunset Visitor to talk about 1000xResist. Welcome to you both. Welcome, Remy.
Thank you. So happy to be on.
You don't sound it.
I'm so happy to be on.
This is what happens. Exactly. Pinki, this is what happens as well when you record on a Friday afternoon.
Right.
Yeah, ahead of time. Pinki, thank you also for being here. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, really happy to be here.
We're all jazzed to be here to talk about 1000xResist. I will say what we're going to do here, we've so much to talk about. This is one of the games that we enjoyed the most last year. It came up a bunch in our Game of the Year discussions, of course. I will say as well, we'll talk about it in a bit, it seems to have had sort of an extra surge of people over December, sort of getting to grips with it and enjoying it for the first time. So we're going to keep this as spoiler-free as possible. Maybe near the end of the podcast, we might get into some of the specifics narratively. But if you are interested in playing this game, maybe give this a skip or wait until some part into the podcast before you check out. This is all kind of your fault, Jesse. I feel like you were the original patient zero on this, I think.
Thank you, Jesse.
Then Jeremy.
Oh, I got you. Look, I'm trying my hardest to not fangirl right now, but I'm losing it. This is so 1000xResist. When I was playing through Next Fest demos, it would have been probably February of last year, maybe even before that. I played the demo for 1000xResist with my buddy, and I was streaming it. And I'll be honest, the first 15 minutes, I was like, "What's going on? What is this? Is this real?" And then the end of the demo hit, and I don't know, it was like I was being washed over with this intense stream of emotion and realizations of what was going on in this world. And I was anticipating it the entire time. I was waiting for it to come out. I played it for an hour, I think right until the end of the demo. Got to the bit that's not in the demo where Zhao is sick in bed. Mm-hmm. That's not a spoiler. She says her line about not wanting to be a photo, and I was like, okay, cool, I'm gonna put this down. I was like, I need a couple months. Came back to it, and then finally played it for Game of the Year, and now here we are. Look at this. We did it.
Exactly.
Who would have thought? Wild.
I want to follow up on that in a second, but first of all, let's get it out of the way. Our incredible Battle Pass holders. I've already warned Remy and Pinki about this part. All of you over at patreon.com/noclip for helping us out and funding our work, including our Battle Pass holders. It's me, Ferrario, Penelope Hayes, Senator Armstrong, Eamon Slattery, Harry Flanagan, Juice, welcome Juice, Arno, Richard Matherson, Matt Pearson, James Brown, Mark Rojas, Tucker Morgan, David McGarry, Sven Huster, Pez, Aaron L. White. There's probably more of these than you guys were anticipating. Ewins Nate, Tim Robinson, Forrest Pruitt, Jonathan Kremen, Eric Hamilton Schneider, Cameron Ladd, Zachary Snader, Alex Sharp, Alex Goucher, George Sekotis, Jacob Godserve. I have to make sure I get this right. It's another new person. Entheogen, not quite sure. Yeah, it's my favorite new diet pill I'm on. Tohir Tiliev, and of course, Ryson. Thank you all so much for supporting our work. Hekki Grace to one and all. Hair to hair to all of you. Let's go back to the start. What were your guys' history in game dev before you founded the studio? I know a lot of this happened around 2020. I know there was predominantly 4 of you. Is that right? How did you come together? What was the impetus behind it?
So we mostly had 0% experience on game dev before starting this. We started it during the pandemic, and I think we said that a lot. And before, we were performing artists, Pinki and I, Pinki and I have been working together for a really long time. And the impetus, I guess, at least on my side, was that it looked like the performing arts touring circuit, which we really relied on, was probably pretty damaged. And even if it were to recover, it would take quite a long time to recover. So I was just kind of like, I think we got to find a different way to practice, at least for myself at that time. Otherwise, I'm going to lose my mind. And so that was kind of some impetus of starting. But Pinki was on quite early, I think, working on the concepts even before we kind of got the company started proper. And yeah, that's kind of that original bit. Our programmer is from AAA Space and has the most experience in games. And thank God for that, because otherwise it would have been a nightmare, I think. And our art director has a kind of animation, illustration, VFX background, but also has no experience in games. So I think it was a lot of people coming together with not a lot of experience in games specifically, but trying to bring whatever background that they had to the company.
Right. Pinki, what type of performing arts were you predominantly involved in? And yeah, was this a story that had been bubbling up? Obviously, I could imagine a lot of it is very personal, but had you put pen to paper on some of these ideas prior to the studio?
Great question. So I came from a dance making and what we call an interdisciplinary background. And so when Remy says we've been working together for a while, it has been kind of bringing together theater, dance, film, and music sensibilities to make something different. Something we're all, I think since 2011, we've been in the project of like trying to look for something we don't recognize in the work that we do. In terms of these stories, yeah, absolutely not. In fact, in many ways, I'm really appreciative of 1000xResist as being a container to tell these stories, at least for the first time for me, because dance is different, let alone like strange experimental contemporary dance with light, sound, and technology. And funny enough, right around that 2020 era, I was also looking for maybe different ways to be a storyteller, different ways to be shaping and crafting space and time. And so it was a very almost, hindsight bias. It just looks as if that was what was going to happen, even though if you told me in 2020 that we'd be at this, we'd be indie game devs, I think I would laugh so furiously. There's just no way I would have known.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by how somebody even attempts to make that transition, because while seeing the final product, I can appreciate to some extent where those sensibilities would have, how you ended up with this type of game. But just in practice, they seem like they're so different in terms of how you create the final piece. It's very, we talk about games all the time, and to me, game design feels so much more rigid than, whatever stuff I saw in the theater or was involved in theater when I was a younger person. It seems like such a creative soup and a miasma that maybe wouldn't translate to the sort of sit in front of a computer for 12 hours a day reality of game dev.
For sure. And I think you speak to something about both like the tension and conflict and struggle that we had in the room for the cultural clash, and also where we were really excited about bringing that kind of soupy, surprising, rise or miss practice to a game setting, knowing that it's actually not done very often because it's risky and costly.
The part that I just imagining would be very frustrating is trying out ideas, whereas like in a physical space with people, you can sort of like jazz and try things out, or at least a version of them pretty quick, whereas like even just concepting an aspect of gameplay and game design then takes days or weeks to sort of implement. Was that tricky, especially at the start when you're essentially trying to build the foundations and the walls of what this thing even is supposed to be?
Yeah, that was like pretty hugely tricky in the sense that we're used to, like, as you say, in performing arts, like a pretty quick turnaround time to see something on its feet. And obviously in games, you're working in engine, you're working in our case, we were working in Unity. There was a couple of months where we were putting up the scaffolding of just the project. Really with the mind that we wanted to move quite quickly when it came to making material. So a lot of like tools, of course, all tools are kind of designed trying to allow for quickness and ease for the artist to just reduce any friction. But regardless, based on our past experience, it's like there is friction in everything in game development. Like everything you do is like full of friction and strange things and strange arcane ways you may do it. And so I think that's something that we were adjusting for. And also from like a kind of strange historical perspective, like I don't know if this game could have been made like 10 years ago, in the sense of just like the tools have gotten better to really allow for a more, for that turnaround time to be collapsed a bit. And so I think that's kind of an interesting thing for us, where it's like, oh, we came in kind of just at the nice round of time where some of these technologies are somewhat mature, maybe. Like I say this even though I get frustrated with Unity all the time, but like, I'm still thankful that like the tools are where they're at, that it allows us to have that turnaround not be like hugely long, right? Like there's stories of like game development that, you make a build and you have to go for lunch and then you come back. That kind of old school thing was not something we had to deal with.
Sorry, Pinki, go ahead. Were you going to say?
I was just going to add on, in some ways, I think that we experienced a little bit of the difference, the opposite, in that what we're always griping about in the performing arts is how much work it takes to get to do the work.
Right.
Where you're like, you're scheduling the people, you're looking for a venue, you're like loading in your gear, and then the union people need their smoke breaks, and then everyone has to, and then the room is locked and you stand outside, and then you have to pay to open your own computer and start working again. There's a lot of friction there. That was also a bit of my fatigue with like as a choreographer. I basically out of the year, I am trying to get to the place where I'm in a room with people to work. And then by the end of the year, I've mostly done the administration and production elements for that. And then I'm in the room working on my craft for maybe like 3 weeks of the entire year. Whereas there's a turnaround time in even whether you're working in engine. Like, yeah, for example, you want a building, we can get a building. But if it was a theater production, say, then to get the set design team on board and the kind of, and even the, the ecological footprint. Do we like this building? Well, it's taken 4 weeks and now we have to like this building. This is the only building we're going to have. So enjoy it and build the play around it. And
I think this is like a good distinction to make, because like, yes, while there's friction in the actual creation process, turnaround time working in engine, on a micro level, on a macro level, we were moving way faster than we were used to, because we were generally doing this full time, compared to, as Pinki said, like much of our experience in the performing arts, and this is something to be said about just arts in general. We spent at least like 80% of our time doing administrative work. And I'm sure maybe you might understand it. It's just like we spend so much time doing paperwork, so much time setting up the conditions even to get in the room to make the thing. Whereas there was like a double adjustment on doing games. We were spending most of our time doing it, so like we were moving at a pace that we were unfamiliar with. But so that was faster, but actually from a kind of moment to moment creation level, that was slower. So it was like kind of like a double thing, I guess.
Yeah, it sounds like it required a lot of adjustment from you guys, and like Pinki was talking to, perhaps with the other side of the team, a mismatch in terms of what expectations perhaps were. I can imagine that from what little work I've done in the arts and friends who've worked in the arts, that the one area in which you might have been a superhuman level good at was getting funding. Was that the case? Okay. I wanted to ask about how your deal came, your publishing deal came through, considering as well, like you're basically coming at this with, maybe there's a technical and artistic backbone there, but there might be some reticence with some folks who don't have video game experience coming over. How was all that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, just to even talk about the funding aspect of like artists' kind of muscle for that. There's like a secret medium that exists in all the arts, and that is application writing. That no one tells you that you actually have to learn and do and practice alongside your actual art. And we often say that we're bringing performing arts techniques into video game development. But honestly, the thing that is most absolutely transferable and necessary is our experience of 10 years writing applications and grants and all of that stuff. If we didn't do that,
doing stuff within a tight budget, I imagine.
Yeah,
just having that
absolutely.
mentality. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I think if we didn't have that experience, we would definitely not have been able to do what we did. And specifically with funding, what happened was, like, I guess at that time I was just working by myself on the prototype, and that prototype was completed, and we submitted to multiple publishers. And this is interesting because Noclip did that video about submitting the car game. I forget the name of the car game.
Stunt Derby. Yes,
Stunt Derby. Yeah, Stunt Derby to multiple publishers. So you kind of understand like that process. And then Fellow Traveler was somebody who was interested kind of right off the bat, and we kind of kept talking to them. And to their credit, and also to the credit of the scout at the time, Felix, they were ready to really embrace the fact that we were not from video games. So one of the ways that we approached the funding is that we, together with them, we applied for Canada Media Fund here in Canada, which I think is like a really important mechanism for funding here in Canadian indie games, and you can kind of see that throughout different games. Like, for example, Seasons is like a game that has, I believe, Canada Media funding, and many games.
I think there's been a few we've covered over the years where it's popped up on the intro.
Yeah.
So so
we're very thankful to have that kind of thing, but the turnaround time for that application was like a week. And I think it was just a real grind to get that. I don't think I slept very much during that week.
A week. That is such a short window of time to have to do all of that. Like, the application process was what in terms of getting the funding? Like, what did you have to show?
Yeah, like if we're going to go into, this is like, there's, I think at least like 30 pages of material you have to make. You have to fill out a budget based on their template. You have to, 30 pages of documents or something like this. You have to explain the game, obviously. You also have to make a business case for the game. You have to explain your partners. You also
make
have
a cultural case for the game?
Yeah, you definitely is made a cultural case for the game. And that's kind of also where some of the arts application writing came in. It's like we were very good and used to understanding, translating, a cultural impact of a possible cultural impact of something. And then we also had to send in the prototype, screenshots, a trailer. What else is it usually involved in this? Canada Media Fund only provides 75% of the total budget of the funding, so you have to go find 25% of that, which is where the publisher came in, which was really great. And so that was a trial by fire for sure. And so thank you to Karen at the CMF for taking my calls in Montreal quite early in the morning, because I woke up, I'd be like getting up early and like calling Karen, and who was one of the officers for that program, and I was like, well, how do I do this? What's going on? It was like a completely new funding body, I guess, that than we're used to applying to. Like, we in Canada as artists, we would apply for Canada Council for the Arts funding. I can't believe I got to say Canada Council for the Arts on a Noclip thing. That's a surreal
All
collision
right, if
of
you had that
worlds.
on your bingo card, scratch it off, folks.
The
It's been a
CRTC
while.
are cheering for this episode. They're like, finally,
Yeah.
somebody mentioned it. Yay.
Yeah. So this completely new funding body that, was just, we had to kind of get used to pretty quickly, and it worked out. So it's like it was a succession of minor miracles for the game to exist, I think.
Terrific.
Throughout development and then also through, early.
What did that pitch, that vertical slice, whatever, what did that look like? Was that like the opening, like the Next Fest stuff that Jesse played, or was it a very different type of thing? Or
I think it was definitely weirder than the final game itself in a lot of ways, and it was the kind of chapter one, largely as it was.
Running around the school talking to weird kids.
Yeah.
Post-apocalyptic.
I think the kids were weirder, or like they were not weirder at the time. I think they were just said less and were more disturbed.
Was the rapper there? Was the rapper in the original
The rapper had
school?
not yet, but there was a kid
No.
that said the bad kids stay, the good kids go.
Okay.
And there was Secretariat only was speaking with Kalmoji at the time. So that, there was also, so, but much of adapting the first chapter was an interesting process because we were like taking from that prototype and I don't know, maybe Pinki, you remember the prototype a little bit differently than I do because.
No, I think that was roughly it. Like Zhao was there. You start to get a sense of her significance a little bit. I think there was a little bit of running in the streets. I think the gym being this weird place or like bumping into redacted stuff was there. But also I think that the art style was a little scrappier too at the time. So it made it, it made it kind of like weirder.
Yeah, it was a pre-Kodai thing, right? And so everything looked a little bit stranger. not in like a very specific way, I guess. Like in a kind of like perhaps it was a little bit more punky at that time because of just how it was assembled.
I guess what was the pacing is like a really important thing in games, and usually you have like sort of your primary moment to moment stuff, and then you add in different aspects at different times to keep the player engaged over longer periods and stuff like that. I remember having played like maybe half the game, suddenly stepping back and going like, I don't know what I'm playing this game for lots of reasons that I'm enjoying. It's keeping up. The pace is working clearly because I'm not putting this thing down. But I don't know what it is that I'm doing moment to moment that is giving me that feeling. It's not like I'm like, oh, I'm shooting really good, or there's a whole world for me to explore and I want to see more of it. How did you guys land on like what genre even this game was, or what the moment to moment was going to be like, or what was the driver? Obviously narrative is super important here, but there's so much. I think it's a case of somebody who has played a lot of games being presented with something new in a genre, which oftentimes doesn't really present them with something new to really critically think about it. But I guess what type of game were you trying to make, like when you started this whole thing?
I think early on, we did have a meeting where it's like, oh yeah, we're making a narrative adventure game. And that obviously means nothing now because like adventure game means nothing, right? But in my mind, it was like, that if there was some sort of like genealogy of genre, one of them would be point and click adventures for sure. And then subsequently some of the kind of, what's that company called? Oh man, time truly is cruel. Like this is like a company I should Tales. Telltales. Yes. But there's also another company that is no longer around. Tale of Tales that made these experimental games previously. That was very inspiring to us. And then of course there's Kentucky Route Zero, which is almost like a merger of those two things, which is kind of very point and click adjacent, but without all of the inventory puzzles and all that stuff. And I think that was Kentucky Route Zero was something that we would constantly reference as in like, okay, it it was one of the first indie games that I played that convinced me, at least, that like, oh, maybe we could do something in the game space. But then also specifically that it was removing things as opposed to, say, adding them, or like removing things first, which is something we kind of followed. So in our minds, it was like, oh yeah, I guess it's like Kentucky Route Zero. Right. But then, of course, you go back and you're like, yes, of course, there's also Grim Fandango, and there's also all of those other, the Dig, I guess. And yeah, so that's kind of what we were thinking on the quite early on. But we were also being very ruthless about, let's remove everything we think is necessary for it to be a game. And specifically focus, because like Kentucky Route Zero did that to a certain extent. Like all of those point and click mechanics were largely gone, and it made room for a bunch of new things. And so, and this is something that Pinki and I would always do in performing arts as well. We just come to the conclusion that I think that subtraction is really important and vital. That you got to like subtract something from a thing, and then it makes a room. And in that act of subtraction, it makes room for a bunch of stuff that you didn't consider before. And then you got to fill that, that kind of absence with new things.
Is it like a way of putting a creative restraint on yourself, or making the box smaller? Or
I think for sure, like it's like it definitely makes the box smaller immediately. And then you have to build like on top of what that kind of like little detritus of what you have left. And then, to answer your question about the pacing, it's like, this is, in the game, there's no situation where you're dragging a dumpster to climb on the dumpster to climb on a ledge, right? Like that's
I was
really
begging
great
for one of those. I was like, when are we going to have the annoying puzzle? I need one. Come on.
And that's a really great pacing tool though for a designer, right? And so we didn't have any of that, and we realized by subtracting all of that, it made things actually really difficult, and it was pretty difficult game to make in this regard, because what keeps you playing is all these different things. Like you want to find this out, you want to understand this more, you got to all these kind of things, which are kind of happening in an abstract space and like not inside of, it's not in engine, I guess, for sure. That kind of thing that's keeping you playing. I don't know, Pinki, maybe you have also some thoughts about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess just you saying that reminds me, like in many ways in the performing arts world, we're chasing affect. And so like what is keeping us there, or what is keeping the player playing, or what is engaging the body of the audience is actually something a little bit maybe nonverbal. It's like something that's hard to describe, but we know when the space is activated and we know when it's happening. So I think that perhaps that's something that we were, the fact that we work in abstract mediums was working to our benefit. It also makes me think that in working in subtraction and in working with less, it just means that it's harder to make you can't just put interesting things on top of interesting things and hope it's interesting. Like, we have to fight for it being engaging a little bit. Like it has to win us over with its small mouth, effectively. And I think as a writer, as a poet, I think that challenge is way more interesting than everything possible. And that it is true that in lots of ways, games allowed us to world build in a way that we could never do on stage. And that could lend itself to all sorts of almost like overwhelm of possibility and choice. And so I think naturally, to bring us back to the practice that we know, we had to set up, there's already so many of friction and parameter, but for us to know what our own constraints were so that we could really track if we were being effective on our own terms. Yeah.
Is it harder to do that when it's a medium where the audience isn't in the room with you?
Oh, that's a really good question, because we are very used to uncomfortably sitting with the audience.
So it's easier then, maybe.
Well, no, I mean, like it is actually harder for sure because, like, you know, playtests are solitary things often, and so if you get somebody to come playtest the game, you try to not be around them because you don't want them to play differently, or whatever, just because you're like hovering over their shoulder. And, you know, we would just record a video of that. We would record a video of, I know Naughty Dog has some outrageous, like, you know, like multi-sensor eye tracker, heart tracker, sweaty, your perspiration. But like for us, I think we just used like a webcam and recorded the gameplay footage. But it was like we would try to stay away, and whereas the opposite, in performing arts, like you don't want to stay away. You want to be next to that person, especially when you're just trying to show them what you've worked on, to even get a sense of like the feeling or energy that they may have while experiencing it.
I don't know if I necessarily disagree, but I don't think we were too worried about the player, to be very honest. Like, I think that Connor and I think so many people in the room play so many games that there was just an intuition about like where we go next and does it feel good and would I want to keep playing? Because I don't really play games, and that's not my background, and that's not where I come from. The fact it's good that I wasn't working in engine is like I didn't have much to do with the pacing. I had more to do with the pacing within scenes, but in terms of how the distance that you have that your player has to travel from point A to point B, and when you're going to bump into this situation and this situation. I think I'll also add that Remy being from a composition background, that kind of like rhythmic understanding of how to create experience and allow meaning to unfold, like that temporality, I think that a lot of that was embodied as well. Like I when I think about our process, when it came time for playtesters to playtest, we were just looking at very minute things. But in terms of pacing, in terms of shape of experience, everything was already kind of there.
I will say that, we do generally lean on our own intuition on the pacing side. And I think during the playtest, it was more, we had a form where it's like, can you objectively explain what happened, right? Just to kind of get a sense of like, did they if it was like completely wrong, then maybe we would have a problem. You know what I mean? And so we had a little bit of a process there. But I think Pinki is right that we do lean a lot on our own intuitions when it comes to in terms of pacing or fulsomeness. And then, sometimes a playtest may kick that back in our face, and and then we would have to address it. But
was that ever something that played into the design of the actual game? Because I really appreciated how 1000xResist is so focused on the story, and like it's not held down by the player's ability to perform certain actions. There's no like QTEs. It's hyper accessible in that way. But when you were designing moments in the story, or even the perspective changing in playtest, did you ever notice that players were having a tough time maybe with there's times where it becomes a top-down experience? Did you have to make adjustments in that, or did any of that play into your playtesting design changes?
We definitely playtested those things, and that was kind of where like the gameplay video in their face, if they were like, then maybe we would look at it.
But I think we found it took them to do chapter 1, basically.
How long it took them to do chapter 1. Actually chapter 1, maybe we've forgotten, like blocked this from our brain, but like we playtest, like chapter 1 was maybe like the most heavily playtested and changed thing. It was one of the very first things that we worked on, right? So it was maybe inevitable. But in terms of the perspective changes, I think most of them stayed quite intact throughout. And then we did have to, polish some of like the different kind of camera control schemes as we were making them, because we were like always stumbling on something that we didn't account for in the character controller, because we we were trying to make a character controller that could accommodate all the perspectives. But I think largely there was no big perspective changes based on playtest. It was largely when people felt like they didn't understand what was happening, or things like this that would coming up, that we would always maybe change some wording here or there based on that. And
to extend on Jesse's point, one aspect that I guess has some sort of win condition at the end of the game when there's a timer on it is the, I don't know what you call it, the jumping, the flying.
The zip. We just called it zip internally, and then there was never never a word for it in the game, and so like we internally were just like, just call it zip, and then anyways, that's it made it into the settings, I guess.
That was an interesting aspect of the design that did require a level of skill maybe from the player that is above the baseline, perhaps. And also just mechanically, it's really enjoyable to do, but I can't think of another game where I've done exactly that. Like, it's such a unique and simple in some ways, but obviously you got a lot of mileage out of it as well.
I think we had designed that specifically to be very simple, as the only thing that we had as from a design side to pace something.
Right.
And then the other version of the zip, the reason why we wanted to have them was because we wanted to use the occupant, this is a spoiler now, this part, occupant kind of ring as the thing specifically, and then so that you get acclimatized to those showing up inside of Communion, so that when it showed up in the end of chapter 5, you're like, WTF, what's going on?
That was maybe when I realized that that's what they were in those zips and what that implied. That was one of the biggest, like, oh shit moments for me.
Nice.
There was so many of these like little mini revelations. I do want to talk about the story in a second. I feel like we're sort of, it's the elephant in the room and in the way, because I know once we crack that egg, it's going to be hard to move away from it. But I'm also just what you guys were saying earlier about like it's incredible you had that confidence to go with your gut, I guess, and in what it translated your sort of confidence and experience from the arts world into games, that you still had that sense of like what the player is feeling. I have one sort of broad question about the story before we get into the nitty gritty, which is like, we're talking a couple of days away from the passing of David Lynch, and he's one of the linear narrative people in the filming field who very much embrace this idea that the story is somewhere in between the piece and the audience, that like you are, you're not necessarily trying to tell the audience a lesson or tell them something, but like when you watch Mulholland Drive, the idea is that the person themselves, in that space is where the truth is found, and there is no sort of objective truth. When you were writing your story and putting this together, Pinki, I'll pose this to you. Was how much of this was you trying to like create a piece of sort of hard sci-fi that really explored specific things, and how much of it was about what you thought would, I guess, resonate with people on an individual level?
Ooh. I guess the first thing I think about is how much the story was devised. And so in a lot of ways, choices took place in the writer's room. And in many ways, when people ask us like, oh, how did we write it? We were kind of always like, how did we write it? I think we knew there's a couple of things thematically we knew that mattered to us. And so that was always in the room, and many of those things are true of kind of our identities and lived experiences. So we didn't really necessarily have to work too hard to cultivate that. I think in many ways, similar to what you were saying, Danny, like watching the pieces unfold and then playtesting it ourselves, and then rearranging it, and then playtesting it ourselves, and then starting to understand what the game itself was also saying and doing, and that it had its own momentum and it had its own way with the themes. It's funny.
That sounds like a very art world thing to do, and
For
not
sure.
something we hear from a lot of developers. It's like, oh, the game is telling us it's this. Like that we. That's very fascinating.
I think
I think it should be said that we made the game really. Yeah, just a quick detail here is that we did make the game quite sequentially. So one chapter
so you
at a
made
time.
the chapters in order that they
Yes.
play.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah. So it was kind of like run like a little mini TV series for ourselves.
That's
in
interesting.
that sense, we were kind of
Wow. Yeah,
making
especially
one
given the
chapter.
non-linear nature
Yeah,
of the
that's why I'm so
game. I think
confused.
that's the part that's
Sorry, I give it back to Pinky. What were you saying?
no, that's exactly it. I'm just reminded of, I think at some point I was playing the ending, and I think I exclaimed to Remy, "Oh my gosh, it's actually about the things we thought it might be about, like the things that we put on the Steam page 4 years ago. I think it's true." Like similar to, in fact, writing grants for art making, where you have to declare
Right.
what it is and why you should do it and why you should give me money, and its societal and social importance and everything is going to change, like, and all the people who are going to come and the communities you're going to engage, and you're just bullshitting because you haven't begun. And so there's a speculative fiction project there in and of
Oh yeah,
itself.
no. How did we learn to write speculative fiction? We wrote grants.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. It's also a very good proxy for the type of, forward-thinking political ideology in the game of, if we just do this, then we'll get there. If we just choose this path, then that's the sacred land we'll end up at. You're kind of, always hedging your bets or optimistic. Let's talk about the story for a little bit. Jesse, I want to throw this to you actually, because I feel like, and it's a shame Jeremy isn't here as well, because I know he had loads and loads to say about it during Game of the Year stuff. But what aspects of themes of the game do you want to ask the guys about?
Oh, I mean, growing up, I didn't know much about the Asian diaspora. I'll be completely honest. Growing up in elementary school, I grew up in an area that didn't have a lot of people from different Asian cultures. Like I knew a couple of Chinese kids. That was literally it. And then I went to an inner city high school and I got to know these people. I had Lao friends, Cambodian friends. I have friends from South Korea. Like I know so much about these different cultures from being there. So just getting to play 1000xResist and seeing like the challenges that Iris's mom went through immigrating, and seeing how that impacted Iris. And then of course the whole narrative of the game is, what if a girl who never got to process her trauma ended up creating a sci-fi world? Like there's so much to that. What do you get out of that? So that part of it really stuck out to me, especially as someone who grew up, like I'm Dominican, half Dominican. My father passed away when I was really young, so I don't know anything about that culture, and I could see a lot of myself in Iris. And not too much, to be fair. I didn't like put gerbils in the oven or anything, but I could feel
That's the worst thing she ends up doing.
What do you mean ending the world? The gerbil is the worst part. No. But I could feel that like envy for somebody else of being confident in their culture and who they are, and how that really fed into her envy. So like, were you drawing from something in particular there, or was that just like a well-observed character arc?
You should go, Pinky.
Okay.
So you're, I think, thinking about this envy, something I was really interested in bringing to the room was the kind of the way that we live in this strange contemporary society where sometimes just by nature of diaspora groups and how globalized we've become, many BIPOC are kind of like left to size each other up based on how colored you are, like how close you are to your culture, so to speak. And so I think something about lateral violence was important for me to address. How much, like, maybe from the outside, maybe an outsider would see these people as, oh, you all are in the same camp, right? But that like, if you zoom in, there's just so much micro political stuff that's playing out, and there's just a lot of stuff that's often not talked about, because I think that I think it's shame-inducing. I think it just says a lot about the stuff that we haven't unpacked yet, the things that kids learn to do without knowing why they're doing it. yeah, if I sat long enough, maybe I'd like think about the fact that I did get bullied in Chinese school by a bunch of other Asians that were like just cooler than me and were already fluent, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's just many. I think that looking at the Asian identity, the Asian diasporic identity, there's just a lot of like kind of cool threads to pull in there, and I say cool in also a cruel way. Like there's lots of messy stuff to unpack.
Yeah, that really resonated, I think, with me and my just personal experience. So thank you for making a game that speaks to something so particular and yet so broad that so many people can appreciate on a wide level. I feel like, because again, I can't connect on a specific cultural level, but just being able to see that represented in a story in a medium that very rarely gets to or has the opportunity to tell these kinds of stories really meant a lot to me. So thank you for making that. But then past that, I have another question that's not so personal about the story of Iris's parents, and the immigrant process of coming to Canada or just anywhere really, and like it relates a little bit to the diaspora, but like more specifically the generational loss of like your own culture, writing a story about those characters and then playing that into Iris as well. It's like, I don't know. I felt this level of, like it was my mom, like, which doesn't make any sense because my mom's not the person who immigrated to Canada, but I could, finishing this game made me want to hug my mom, really is what I'm trying to say. It's like the motherly love there. But the trials that Iris's mom and dad go through, and then the place of Hong Kong, like the way that impacts these characters and is carried over into their own lives, their struggle, their fighting for their freedom and their rights. The way that plays into the game's story, I think is impeccable. Especially there's one moment in particular that I saw, and I guess we're already in spoiler territory, so I don't mind bringing it up. But there's one moment, and I'm sure you've been asked about this in the past, but the segment, I think it's chapter 7, maybe late chapter 6, where you go to Hong Kong, like you get that shot, and it's live action footage. Like, what is the story behind that? Why is it live action footage? Why was that the moment that you said this needs to be like that?
Is Pinki? I think Pinki's looking at me to answer this. So that the video part is really interesting because like we had decided to do chapter 7 as essentially with a kind of spirit of a bottle episode. And we were just like, okay, chapter 6 was really hard to make and we're tired. And so let's do a bottle episode. That's what they do on TV shows, when they need to, they don't want to go shoot on location. Let's use existing sets and set it in a room with 2 people. Of course, we learned the harsh way that for video games, that's actually really hard to have just 2 people in a room where you like talk. And so that led to chapter 7 actually being quite difficult to make. And then by the end of it, we knew that we wanted to make a kind of to show the first communion. And originally I think we had planned to do it in 3D or just in engine. But at the end of when I got to that part, making it in engine, I was like, oh God, I can't. I'm like, I don't know. Like, I don't think it's going to, or I had an instinct that it's just not going to work, like it's just not going to work. It's too much. But the story behind that video is that I had a bunch of hard drives of footage that me and other collaborators had shot from Hong Kong in 2017. And that was kind of like a freewheeling experimental documentary project. And so we shot a lot of footage over like a month while we were there. And so I was like, okay, I guess it's time to dig into that. And I did, and that's how we got that video. So a lot of that footage is actually shot for that project, and now gets to live its life as the actual eventual documentary that we made. Like, we kind of put a lid on it right now because of the nature of it. And it was great to use that footage by those collaborators who shot it, and it gets to live this life now in the game. So it's interesting because I truly believe like the energy of the thing when you capture it stays with that thing, even if it, carries on. I'm kind of romantic that way.
No,
so
beautiful.
like it's contained inside that thing somehow in an unquantifiable way. And definitely I think that time in 2017, all the people who helped us make that and shoot those footage, both in Hong Kong and from the team that went there from Canada, like is kind of around in that footage too. So
yeah, it's funny. Even without the context of when it was filmed, there's a sweetness to that when it comes on that feels like very like warm, like the train pulling into your hometown or something. There's like that feeling of
well, that one shot in the taxi was actually just my friend Seper. I think we Seper sitting in the taxi shooting whatever. Like I guess he was just he kind of just there's people like this when you give them a camera, right? And it truly was a long taxi ride back from we had shot this really grueling series of stuff, I think, where someone buries themselves. And we didn't bring any water because we were so stupid. We were stupid and young. We didn't bring any water out there, and we were just dying out there. It was so hot, and so we're coming back in these taxis, and he's just shooting this. So it is very much a train pulls, like we're all, this kind of like afternoon lazy thing.
It's one of the things, just because Jesse mentioned the parents as well, that kept with me. And there's some stuff I don't want to say necessarily publicly on a podcast, but there was one aspect that was that really stuck with me, which was that like I have just a 6-year-old daughter, and I mean, I guess there's the element of the fact that she's half Irish, but to me, it's not a comparable comparison, especially regarding where Ireland is at the moment. We're in such a great position, but the only childness of it was the part that I found that I was really like, I don't know, was I was definitely curious about it. It's something I think about a lot because as a parent, if you're in a position as a parent where you are able to make that choice, if you can have more kids and have decided not to, there is a sort of a guilt associated with that, or I'm constantly wondering. I grew up with 2 siblings, right? And I'm constantly wondering, like, did we make the right choice? And she's she's the most social kid in her class, and she has no one at home to talk to except us. And that whole thing was like, I kept like gut checking myself against it about like how you ruin your kids as an only, like how much freedom you can give them and how much you need to parent them more. And it was, I felt, are you guys only kids at all? Did you turn out okay?
Please, someone say yes.
Exactly.
That's so fascinating, Danny. I want to hear way more about where and when and how that came up for you. But something that it makes me want to mention is that it was really clear to me, like earlier, I think I had used the word violence, and I think that I'm often thinking about there's just the intergenerationality it's just complicated. And when I think about Iris's parents, I think about my own parents, and I think about how I've treated my parents, and the ways that we have culturally clashed. For me, in many ways, the practice was to humanize the parents and make it so clear that it's like parenting is impossible. It's an impossible task. Kids are bonkers. Like there's so many things that you cannot control, and there's so many things that just depending on how things play out, it was either a good choice you made or not a good choice, and it's kind of senseless because you can look back and be like, oh, I did everything I could. Was it good? Was it not? Like there's just so much. It's just an impossible vacuous space.
there was so many, when we did the Game of the Year stuff, there was so many like moments that I feel like lines of dialogue and aspects of the story that sort of pinned each of us in our own different ways. But the sort of unifying aspect of it, I think that everyone really enjoys, is just how well of a job you guys did with regard to voice casting this thing. Like, what was that process like? Because there's a lot of dialogue as well. You have a lot of lines to implement. You have characters with the same voice who aren't necessarily playing the same version of a character. It doesn't sound like game voice acting a lot of the time. It sounds like something else. It sounds, it's so, the whispery graveliness of some of them, and they're almost inward speaking. Like, it feels, very different. Where did you find these people, and how did you approach that whole puzzle?
I think a lot of much, if not all of the voice cast are actually local performers here in Vancouver.
Oh, cool.
And many of them were in our community in the performing arts that we were trying to, let's bring them along and do voiceover for a video game. And there's a whole mix of cast members who are trained, some untrained, and then some, who've never done any acting whatsoever before. Like we also have dancers who haven't done voice things before, but the way that we cast it was that we cast everybody, well, at least all the major people, I think. Pinki, tell me if I'm wrong. Before we largely started writing anything. So we definitely cast, I believe, Ni as Watcher before we wrote that many lines of dialogue for Watcher. And then much like the rest of the game, we were recording while we were making the game. And so we would record chapter 1, and then, Pinki and I would get to be in these sessions, and we would be like, oh, we're learning so much about Watcher and Ni in these sessions. It would influence how we would continue to write and learn. And we would also learn as writers how to write better dialogue for these characters. And then I think some of their personality started to creep into the characters a little bit, more so than others, but like there was definitely a kind of circular feedback loop with writing the line, going to record it with the actors, and then writing more lines for them and stuff like that. But also because many of these performers were from theater backgrounds, they would get in we stopped. I think at one point we stopped putting our headphones on right away. So, because like we knew the very first take that they would do, they're just like talking to the back of the theater. Like they're projecting their voice as if they have to reach the back of the theater, right? And so, and then we usually just let them do that the first, because like we like to not give direction right off the bat. Like we just want to see what they want to try. But oftentimes, especially if they're not like voiceover professionals, they would, project quite far. And we would usually have to spend some time being like, actually, this is the one time you don't have to project at all. This is the time where, any little thing that you do with your voice and your stomach gurgling in the booth, we'll hear that and it'll be recorded. So, think about it in that kind of way. And we would slowly gravitate towards a performance that I think we all felt was working, I guess. And this was, different for everybody and different for every single character. And some characters are definitely harder than another. I think Ni did a really good job differentiating Blue and Watcher. But that process took, I think at least 4 hours in which we were exploring how exactly is Blue different from Watcher, and also still seemingly sounding close enough. But Pinki, I don't know. What are your thoughts on the voiceover stuff? There's like so much.
Yeah, there's a lot to say, but maybe more generally, just to answer that question, I think as an aesthetic and style, I think that we were not drawn to like performativity and an animated voice. And we really wanted these sisters to be a little tortured. We wanted them to be a bit inward focused and worn. And you know, we just like noticed right off the bat that our mic would pick up anything and everything of nuance, and that they actually had the less work that they were doing in the booth, the more that we were really drawn to the performance, and we're kind of drawn into intimacy rather than being told what was happening or how we should feel about this character. So I think across the board, even as artists, that's more of our interest. Is a bit of an unconventional approach to this kind of to these actors acting and these NPCs doing their thing. And I think like some are sillier than others for sure, and we definitely took liberties. But in general, I think that was more our interest.
The old adage of if somebody's whispering, you have to lean in to listen to them, and you're in their space then, and if somebody's projecting, you're almost sort of it goes a long way to explaining maybe the sense that I had that I was getting sucked into that world where they weren't really telling me something, they were saying something, and I was lucky enough to be there to be able to hear it or something, you know.
That was actually something I wanted to ask about with the storytelling, especially in the way that you built this sci-fi world that's so alien from our own, to the point that they're learning about our own world and they're just like, women have periods? What do you mean? What's the point of that? They bleed? They leak? It's called leaking. Something that really drew me in right away, it's like one of the first lines you hear in the game is these idioms that are used throughout 1000xResist, of like hair to hair, red to blue. I don't know. As soon as Jeremy and I realized we both played it, we were just popping off like, yeah, man, it's square 6-1, baby. Where did that all spawn from? Was that like naturally over time, or is that just like inside jokes that you've had that made their way into the game?
Well, I think, it started with an inside joke, and then that spawned into a poem, I believe. And that poem we would pull. I mean, it's interesting. We used to have this like, well, why are you laughing?
I'm laughing because I'm remembering the origin story of the theme, the line Hekki Grays.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, can you tell it? Actually, I can't remember.
No, you tell it.
I don't remember which one. Like, I don't know if we're like referencing the same thing. Because you definitely.
No, I think it's just we're on I guess we're on Slack, and you were like kind of calling us to a meeting or whatever, not because it was time for you, me, and Connor to head on to Miro to do our thing, and you I think you were trying to say hello and you just spelt it wrong, but you also announced it with like in all caps, and
do all caps,
and Connor lost it and was like, oh my gosh, let's and just like kind of popped off, just like just ran with it and was like, oh my gosh, I really do think in my mind it was Connor being like, should they just have all of these weird ass sayings that like are so normal for them, and like their own slang and their own high fives kind of thing, and yeah,
and I do think like there was a removed section part of the game. It's interesting because like sometimes people are like, oh, it's so cool that the first choice is these things you don't understand, which was definitely not the situation when we first started developing the game. Like I think we had a bunch of things in there before kind of ramping you up to those kinds of things. But then slowly over time, we just felt like I guess we didn't need them, and then we cut them all. And so part of those things, I think they got the most use early on when we were trying to tutorialize something. I can't remember. And then it just kept kind of memeing throughout the writers that we would do all these different, we would use these sayings in all these different kinds of ways. And then even the second half of the game was at that point, I think we were tired of it. And so there was a real reaction from the provisional government to be like, hey, don't say those things.
God, I am
anymore.
fascinated by this linear design thing you've done. How did you stop yourself from going back and editing older chapters, or did you stop yourself?
We definitely did go back and edit older chapters. I think chapter 1 was the one that went through the most different, specifically the beginning of the game, went through the most different types of iterations. But we did go back, like for example, the chapter 4, the occupant cave thing. Us trying to gravitate towards the occupant way of speaking took actually quite a long time and quite a lot of iteration and playtesting actually for that one.
That's the most poetic aspect of it. Who's the poet on the dev team? Because that whole aspect of it, I adore. Like, it's basically you're basically writing like a little haiku or sonnet or poet in that section. Like, it's beautiful. Yeah. I love that part. And obviously, it comes back around again later at the end of the game. But yeah, that stuff was very fascinating.
It's interestingly, I think. The inspirations that we had at the time were like, because I think it was more flowery before. Quite early on, it was like kind of flowery, and then some of it was just stubbed in because we were like, I don't know, how do we, and then
I don't know, a son and another son and something.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But then, I think, it's.
I don't know. I'll ask Grok or Gemini. Write me a poem.
This is funny that you bring this up, because like it was influenced by some like writings of Gertrude Stein, and then also apparently the language that was being made up between these two chatbots. Had Met, like, do you remember this? Like, I think it was Meta had shut down their chatbot translation service, because the two chatbots started making up an interim language to talk
why
to
did
each
they
other.
Shut down the cool shit that happens? Like, this emergence.
They got really scared. I think they were like, "Oh my god, what's emerging here? We gotta cut it down." And so, but some of the excerpts of that, are them. I guess for whatever reason, between these two chatbots, it's more efficient for them to not count or something, or like they do it in multiple singulars or something like this.
Oh wow!
And so I remember that was one of these influences that like, we should grab that and let that influence how the occupants speak.
It's funny how AI hallucinations and obviously COVID. There's a lot of contemporary stuff that sort of is in there in some respect, but it's not. I wouldn't say it to be overt. Like, weirdly, it took me a long time to real. I guess the opening chapter when they're there to a certain extent, and there's some type of disease happening, and then obviously with the sisters and the masks and stuff like that. But it's, how do you is it like an overt? It doesn't. Nothing about it feels that way. A lot of it feels like you're just pulling in these colors or something to sort of dash on. Put on your little whatever the fucking painters used to do the colors, whatever that thing's called. My vocabulary is great. What was was this just a reflection of the world as you were in it at that time?
Pinki, do you want to talk? I think something that's important to us in our process is always to be as porous as possible to things around us, whether that's things that are happening locally or more, immediately globally in the case of COVID, or just the ways that we're thinking and feeling at any given point in time, which is why, like, say, for example, in chapter 6, like there's like a harsh reaction back to all the stuff that, like, the Hekki graces and all that stuff by the provisional government. Because by that point in time, we were like, we can't write another Hekki grace, so that porousness is something that I think we prioritize and to let into the process as opposed to shut it out. And so much of that stuff kind of comes in and then lives around a bit, and every so often, I guess it starts to coalesce into something, right? Because we knew all the sisters should be wearing masks for maybe like in-game lore reasons, but also, we were thinking
it's
about...
also economical. Don't have to animate.
It's also very economical, yes,
That's
absolutely.
what I was going to add. It was budgetary.
Yeah. It was budgetary.
They not have mouths.
Actually, there's so many decisions, and I'm sure you understand this for sure, like so many decisions that you make creatively out of budgetary concerns, and then you have to lean into them really hard, right? And then turn them into something. The mask was definitely started that way, but then also because of like COVID, and then of course the Hong Kong mask situation before, and just keeps rolling around until it accrues things as we drag it along with us,
I think there's also something about the racialization of COVID that
Right.
that we were really living in Vancouver, and seeing that, like, the rise in anti-Asian sentiment, and being like, oh, this is, wow, okay. Yeah, it was just like, oh, we're in it. So it just seemed like, I think it fed its way into the work too.
Yeah, for sure.
It's remarkable that, like, this is a little, it's a small team. It's an indie game. The game's not short. There's so much in there, and there's so much variety, and it doesn't end earlier, and it doesn't overstay its welcome either, I think, which is particularly important with narrative games as well. But you've pulled so much into it, and yeah, I'm really excited for what you guys next. Selfishly, I hope as artists and creative people, you go whatever way the creative winds are blowing you. But selfishly, I do hope you stick around in the world of games and make some more stuff. Do you guys have any plans for kind of what's next? I know you're still very much within the sort of general post-launch window of 1000xResist, but do you have ideas, or what does even the process of trying to figure out what's next look like for all of you?
We definitely have things that we're working on, and we're probably going to stick around games for as long as we can, I guess. I mean, that's the current thought. Yeah. And so we are working on some things that we can't say, but that process has been ongoing last couple of months. And what does that process look like? I guess, Pinki, like, I don't know, we were tossing a ball around a lot.
Yeah, we tossed around a ball a lot, for sure. I think it's it continues to be, in my mind, it's helpful that we continue to be coming from two games from different backgrounds and from different modalities and specializations, and because I often talk about how it makes me a better writer and it makes me a better narrative designer if I'm, like, kind of out in the world, living and doing and experiencing things, and teaching and studying and doing other, like, somatic or embodied stuff. I feel like all of that comes back and is there and ripe for the page and for when we're, like, conceptualizing of what is to come. And so for me, it's just kind of going back to the drawing board and coming back to some of the practices that feed me as an artist, like hygiene, like artist gym.
Yes.
We did have a moment while we were brainstorming some things, like, relatively recently, where it's like, oh my God, we're like old now. We're like older, or like it felt like there was like a real period of time that 1000xResist was made over. And it felt like, at least for me, time felt very frozen in that regard. And then now it's like you poke your head out and you're like, oh man, like what's going on? Like, yeah, like things have changed. And how, because we were saying we want to be porous to the world, and how trying to, like, just log for ourselves how those things have changed in, like, late 2024 and early 2025 was something I think we had to do, or, like, was helpful to us, or at least was helpful to me. Yeah.
And at the same time, also, like, it helps to be able to do that and to turn it off when you need to. Like, I think one can really get overwhelmed by just how much is happening and how much people are already doing, or how much we're already behind before we've started. And so there is a complexity and a dance to being porous and listening and absorbing of, like, the time. And then there's, like, when we're in it and we're really crafting a world and we want it, again, to be small and concise and know itself, then you kind of also have to be able to parse away all of that to find that essence.
Do you think it's a vocation that you can do alongside being an artist in other ways, or being creatively satisfied artistically, perhaps, is the way to put it? Because so much of what we talk to developers, it is there's a lot of hours needed a lot of the time to get words on the page, or to learn how to render the page. Do you find that you can still have a free flowing, like a vivid life with different things going on, and different creative satisfactions being satisfied?
I'll let Remy answer this first.
Oh, why?
I think because our answers
Because
are
I'm doing a lot
like,
of paperwork. I think that, one of the draws to working in indie games for me is that it's one of these mediums where abstraction is still possible on so many different levels, which allows it to engage at a scope beyond itself sometimes, with an infrastructure that does not need to be as outrageous as, say, like a larger film, right? Like being able to make something like 1000xResist is because of all those things, I think, as opposed to, say, like trying to approach it as a more linear media or something else. So I think, and Pinki can attest to this. Like, I was very frustrated in the performing arts with the scope that we could work at, and even for Pinki, I'm sure, like, we were both trying to work at certain scopes. Not that we want huge scopes, but like, we were trying to let our imagination be realized in some way. And of course, we're not like outrageously, we're pretty grounded, and we knew that we had to curtail it in all these different ways. But even then, after all that, I think we were still kind of coming up sometimes unsatisfied with what was possible for us in that regard. So I do think, creatively satisfied, I do think that this scenario is great, at least for me. Whether it's a rich, full life, I don't know. To be seen, I guess. Yeah.
And yourself, Pinki?
I think Remy and I are very different people. I think as the creative director of the studio, I think that there's a lot more like life buy-in that Remy has had to commit to. I think you had mentioned this earlier about, must be hard to go from like live performance and dancing and rehearsals and engagement with humans on your feet, yada, 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 to staring at a screen day in and day out. And for me, yeah, it's a really rough transition, and it kind of stays rough. And I think even as I age, like how to keep myself sharp, how to keep myself well it's a moving target. And I still believe that I'm like the producer of the artist that has to I'm also the production management team, so I'm also sustainability, and I'm looking out for 5-year, 10-year plan, and so the manager has to kind of call the shots on what I defend and what I protect, and in that way, I think I do think it's a little bit annoying for Remy to work with me, because I do think I come from the performing arts, so it does mean that the asks that I have as a fellow indie game dev is going to be different than somebody who's like maybe just fully immersed in the industry. My schedule's funky and my needs are different, and I'm like, I'm a bit of a loose cannon and a bit of a wild weed, and so yes, all of those things. I think that it continues to behoove me to make sure I get out, see the sun, make different types of art, and something about scale and scope. I think, and Remy is really, really good at seeing scale and scope questions as part of the creative energy and constraint and vision. I think for me, it does a little bit of a different thing where it actually closes down my creativity if I'm thinking about what the output looks like. And so that's the luxury, I think, of having, like, say, the both of us or a number of us who are looking out for different number ones. I think it's really useful that in my practice and in my career, there's many things that I'm making that are almost for nobody, or for one person, or for 15 people at a time, or for my mom, or for my best friend, and that stuff kind of keeps me grounded in like my creative voice, and what I'm doing on the page, or the different things I can do on the page, and just like, keep it colorful.
Excellent. Yeah, I can definitely. We were talking before we came on live, myself and Remy, about just the commitment from an artistic perspective that games require, in that you're committing the next 4 or 5 years of your life to a single piece of something, which is also something that you only kind of own a fraction of. And if you're coming from a different artistic world in which you maybe get a couple of swings of that every year, and every once in a while it can be something collaborative, and every once in a while it can be something purely coming from you, that's a difficult transition to make. And yeah, it's just very interesting to talk to you both about this, because I think there is an argument in games about crunch culture that comes in, that sort of talks about the capitalist side of that argument. But from an artistic perspective, what you were saying earlier about being actively engaged in the world around you is also like super important. Like you can end up committing yourself to games for 10 years. And that's probably why we see a lot of burnout, and then people just have nothing left. And some of that is probably because they worked really hard hours, and then some of it is maybe because they don't have anything left. They committed themselves to this thing so deeply that that's all they had. It's all the nourishment they were getting artistically for a long period of time. It's, these are the worries that youth doesn't have to worry about. These are the worries of people in their later in life. Anyway, it's a pleasure to talk to you both. Jesse, did you have any more questions before we sound it off?
No, I think you got everything. This has been a fantastic conversation. I think it's really interesting to hear from people whose perspective isn't coming from purely video games. You're coming at this from an artistic side of the industry, or side of the world, that I don't think we get to hear too much from, and I think it plays into the game, obviously, but also the way that you've made it. So it's awesome to see, and I'm just so excited, like Danny, for whatever you're making next, whatever that might be. And I hope that you have a long and successful career in games, or wherever you choose to do it.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to Jesse for getting the rest of us to play,
Yes.
Especially like this fucking guy.
There's no way you were going to play this game if I didn't tell you.
This is
No
not like
we heard.
Yeah, I was bamboozled about how into this shit I was. It reminded me of, like, I don't consider myself like a great writer, definitely not writer, great reader. I'm very like I have such ill discipline in many aspects of my life, but in writing. And then when I finally caught on to some really good, sci-fi books that I enjoyed, it was like, oh no, I do get to enjoy these. So yeah, thank you very much for 1000xResist, and yes, all the best working into the future.
Thank you. Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, Danny.
Thanks for coming on, and thank you to everyone for listening to this podcast. That was episode 211. We'll be back next week. I think Jeremy will be back. Frank might still be in Japan.
Good for him.
Jesse. He may never come back.
I'm surprised he did last time, or the time before that.
I know. It's every time it's more and more tentative. Like we might just lose him.
Here's the thing. Go with him, buy some Satoshi Kon, and watch that when you get back, okay? Buy Millennium Actress.
Oh, we'll have to see. We'll be back next week for that. Until then, Hekki Grace, everyone.
Hekki Grace.